Hello and welcome to this PowerPoint presentation entitled Cloud or On-Premise, the Path to a Successful M3 Upgrade. My name's Simon Gartside from Anthesis, and I originally delivered this presentation to the M3 user group meeting in Nottingham, which was for the UK, Ireland and Benelux on May the 23rd. My background is I work for Anthesis now, but for many years I worked for Infor Consulting Services. The last 10 years of my career there was as manager of the global M3 upgrade team, who were involved in not only developing migration tools and processes, but delivering those projects. And in that 10-year period I did that role, we delivered more than 500 successful go lives, and I still work very closely with the M3 upgrade team in Infor. So the presentation today, what I want to cover is some interesting lessons learned from recent project experience, and also talk about where we are in the cloud. We've been migrating customers to the cloud, but we're at an interesting time with the multi-tenant cloud edition product. So I'll talk about that. Okay, on to the agenda. 4 points. One is, when you move house, clear out the attic. And I want to talk about archiving and purging M3 data, which is an interesting subject because not many customers actually address this issue, and I'm now believe that when you upgrade is the right time to consider that. I want to talk about the multi-tenant M3 cloud. We've talked about this a long time, but we're still in a process of transition. I wanted to talk about how you get to the multi-tenant cloud and some of the implications about being in the multi-tenant cloud. Following on about recent project experience about migration by replication. The replication method is one of the two main methods we have for migrating and upgrading customers, and we had some recent project experience there. And similarly with go lives, have the fire brigade handy. Recent project experience on go live support and what might be appropriate there. Okay, so the first subject: when you move house, clear out the data. As you may well know, the M3 is very good at accumulating data in the core business engine database. It's not so good at automatically clearing that down or deleting or removing obsolete or processed data. And historically, few M3 customers have focused on data purging or archiving activities. And that may be partly my fault, because we did not encourage customers to do this as part of an upgrade process, but things have changed. And because of that reluctance, realistically, what most customers do when they upgrade is to migrate an awful lot of junk, which is not necessary and perhaps is not ideal. And I've come to the view now that actually, when you are actually upgrading M3, it is the perfect time to address this purging and archiving issue. And I'll come on to talk about why that is. So why should you do this when you upgrade? Well, the first point is that the archiving and purging process in M3 is not a scary process anymore. It isn't that complicated, and the standard M3 purging and archiving tools are much better than they used to be. And it's fair to say, if you go back in history, even back to RPG days, they were pretty poor. And actually, in fact, it was probably quite a rational thing to avoid that, because problems could occur. That's not the case now. The other point is that with the migration tools that we use, we can configure those just to leave obsolete data behind. If you don't want those sales stats records from pre-2007, you can leave them behind. But the main point really is that one of the objectives, one of the objections to running an archiving or purging project is that it does take a bit of time. Obviously, when you're doing that kind of archiving process, you have to process test things. But actually, when you're doing an upgrade, you actually have to do that process testing anyway. So that means that a purging and archiving aspect of the project would not mean extra testing work. And it's also true that a few actions in this area can produce quite dramatic results. And this is a somewhat extreme case, but it's a recent project that is still ongoing that by some simple housekeeping, we were managed at the start of the project, we managed to reduce the size of their production database by 35%, with no loss of data to users. Now, that's a fairly extreme example, but it's an example of what you can do or what can be done. And it's a truism about the M3 database. Now, the M3 business engine database contains about 3,800 physical tables. Most customers use about 700 to 1,000 of those tables. The rest will be empty, depending on configuration options. But it's always true that the largest 20 or 25 of those tables do account for 80 to 85% of the actual total data volume in the M3 database. And because of that, actions in one or two areas can make quite a dramatic impact. So why would you do that? Why not keep buying disk? It's cheap these days. Well, because eventually, inevitably, as the data builds up, you will degrade the response times in M3 applications. That's just a physical thing with computers. Also, if you're copying databases, saving and restoring, then those times will be reduced. In fact, I was only talking to a customer yesterday, and they copy all their production data every weekend to another M3 database so they can run a financial forecasting system over it. What used to take an afternoon is now taking the entire weekend, so they're talking to us about how to address that. So that's an example of how this can be. As time goes on, then problems can start to occur with this. Of course, if you reduce the size of your database, you will also benefit from any upgrade or migrations being faster and therefore cheaper. And lastly, I'd point out, and this again, this is an extreme example, but you can paint yourself into a corner. A project run in Sri Lanka, which went live a couple of weeks ago, they got to the stage where in their general ledger table they had 3.8 billion records. Now on an iSeries, the maximum physical limit for a table is 4 billion records. So I don't know exactly what would happen, but I think the effects would be unpleasant, to put it mildly. And that's an extremely large database of 16 or 17 terabytes in total, which is quite extreme. But the problem is you can paint yourself into a corner. So in this example, they started an archiving project, of course, but the archive routines were taking themselves weeks and months to run. So when you get to this extreme end, as I said, you can paint yourself into a corner, and therefore it's a good policy to be prepared and not to let this situation occur. So what do we do about it? Well, possible options and strategy. I would argue that the first step of any potential archiving or purging process should be a quick review of what we've got in the M3 database. And this is quite a straightforward operation to do. It doesn't take that long. So identify where the data volume is. Are there any immediate housekeeping issues as per the project I mentioned, where you could have some dramatic effects, some quick wins with these housekeeping actions? And you would then, out of that would come a hit list of potential archive areas where the volume of the data is and what you have to do to actually, and the options around that purging or archiving, etc., etc. And I think maybe some customers are quite experienced with archiving and running it regularly. In fact, I know of one customer who moved to the cloud and they didn't use archiving, they just used SQL to delete out data. But many people don't have much experience in this area. So I would suggest to identify, if you like, a pilot project, a pilot area, whether it be sales stats or SYNAC records or stock transaction history or whatever. Generally a low risk, low complexity area, and run a pilot on that. That has the advantage of building knowledge about the process, which will be pretty well consistent across the different areas, building experience, building confidence to see, yes, it does work, and it's not such a scary process. And then as part of that, following on from that, to establish, I think, an ongoing archiving strategy and policy per area, so that we know that on an ongoing basis, you're not going to hit future problems in terms of massive data volume in a particular area giving you a problem, and performance problems, etc. Okay. So the next subject I want to talk about was the multi-tenant cloud and how to get there. And here's a schematic of how we get to the multi-tenant cloud. In this example, from on-premise. So on the left we have the legacy M3 version on-premise, and it's a straightforward, relatively straightforward process. Slightly different from the single tenant cloud, and I'll discuss that. So the first step is to migrate the M3 data to the cloud. And this is migrated into a staging database in the Amazon cloud. In that cloud, it says M3C, meaning cloud edition or multi-tenant version of M3. We run the fixed programs to transform the data. And then as the final step, the extra step in the process, if you like, the cloud operations team in the cloud team, they will save and restore that M3, your migrated M3 database into the multi-tenant environment. Because, as you may well know, the cloud ops team keep a very close control over what actually happens in the multi-tenant environment. Even though in the multi-tenant M3 version, each customer does have a separate schema or database, the control is still so strict. Has to be. Now, if we just compare this is on-premise to multi-tenant cloud. The picture going from a single tenant cloud environment into the multi-tenant cloud environment is pretty similar, except you're going from within the cloud to the staging area rather than from on-premise. Actually, no new tools were required to deliver this solution because the existing tools allowed us to migrate to the multi-tenant cloud. But we have this extra step of going via a staging area. That is an extra step. It does take a bit of time. The save restore process is from current experience quite quick, but it's still going to take maybe say 3 or 4 hours to do that. So that has some impact on planning, cutover windows, and so forth. So that is a little bit different in terms of a normal single tenant or on-premise upgrade. But that's the technical process. The technical process is not really very significantly different apart from that extra step in terms of saving and restoring. But what's the difference in terms of the project of going to the multi-tenant cloud? So here is a simplified view of, okay, these are the kind of things that we need to do in an upgrade project. From the customer point of view, they need to project manage the process, they need to have project, have process owners, users involved in the technical IT area. From the project team's point of view, obviously project management, business consultants, M3 technical experts, and a migration consultant. So yeah, that's a simplified view of what you need to deliver an upgrade project, I think. So what's different? Well, in the multi-tenant environment, you've got Infor Cloud Ops, and they manage and control what goes on in that multi-tenant environment. I have to say, when I worked for Infor Consulting Services, we did consider why a new team was created for the Cloud Ops rather than using existing experienced people, because that meant they had to learn things again and over again. But of course, on reflection, you needed a separate team to have the drive and the time and the focus to do all the heavy lifting in terms of delivering the cloud stuff. So I can understand why that was done. However, in a project environment, it must be remembered that the Cloud Ops team is a service organization driven by tickets. It's not a project organization. So without any hint of criticism, have all communications between Cloud Ops and project teams been perfect? Probably not. Is it something to be aware of and to manage very closely? Yes, I think it is. Not an insoluble problem, not a showstopper or anything, but just something to be aware of. Also, the interesting thing about the multi-tenant cloud is how it changes the nature or the shape of what we do in terms of upgrading and testing M3. And we're still a bit of work in progress here in understanding exactly what's happening. But because in the multi-tenant cloud, every month there will be an update, and I'll come on to talk about this in the next slide in more detail. And then every 6 months, a more significant update, some kind of testing process has to go on to make sure that those changes don't impact your business. And exactly the nature of that, again, as I said, we will come on to talk about in a moment. So that's going to, instead of having a large input of resources with a periodic upgrade every couple of years, say, then there may be a need for more of this testing and on an ongoing basis. Of course, that does mean extra work, possibly, or a different shape of work. How do we actually deal with that? Well, of course, we can offer managed services to help with not only with the testing of M3 processes, also to backfill with support. So there is help available. We just need to consider what the shape of that extra will be and how best to manage it. But as I said, help is available if required. So let's look at what actually goes on in the multi-tenant cloud. Here we have a picture that in the multi-tenant cloud, every month, the difference is, in theory, the version of M3 will not change. The last upgrade is done. However, every month there are functional changes and corrections delivered and implemented every month, and twice a year with a possibly less than ideal name. Not that I've come up with it. This is an Infor name. There will be what's called a disruptive update, which is a significant update of the M3 application. So obviously there is change going on a sort of more continuous basis, and a significant change every 6 months. So therefore, and as I said, we don't quite know yet, but what exactly is the sensible and safe testing regime in this environment? Well, there has to be one. I would be extremely surprised if people would be comfortable just to accept that these changes will not impact. I know that the idea is that all these new changes are covered by on-off switches, parameter settings, but of course we have to be mindful of making sure that processes are not and cannot be interrupted. So I'd assume, given this 6 monthly disruptive update, there will have to be a significant testing process at least every 6 months, if not every month. And the reason why I say it's not quite understood yet is that I understand from speaking to Henrik Bilgren at the User Association meeting that there are approximately 150 M3 customers with provisioned in the cloud. Of those, about 73 are in the multi-tenant cloud edition. But as of the original date of this presentation on the 23rd of May, none of those customers were actually live in the multi-tenant cloud environment. So we don't have a live customer in the multi-tenant cloud to ask, how is this working for you? What is the kind of testing regime or checking that you have in place? So we're in an interesting point in this process. I'm not suggesting there's a problem, not suggesting everything's going to be bad, but it's always useful to speak to a customer who's been through that themselves already. Of course, the big difference with the multi-tenant cloud is the idea that you're not allowed modifications. Now, the modifications have had a very bad press recently, and you're probably more popular as a bank robber than saying somebody who wants to do modifications to M3. Maybe this criticism's a bit far, I don't know. But it's interesting learning again at the User Association meeting that what's happening now is that M3 is being changed to allow, if you like, hooks to be built in at various points in process flow, i.e. an external call to another function to allow custom functionality to be built in, which is very interesting, and that's in process. And I suspect that's because even though you can do much huge things with extensibility in M3, there are some things that you can't do with sort of an added on bit of extensibility. That's my personal view. And I suspect that once you've got custom code being called from within M3 in your environment, I don't know how to describe that except as a mod. But so we need to be very careful about looking at what the control and the standards and documentation is around this, because certainly if you have what you might call an old style Java mod to M3, one of the great advantages is that has a very strong standards background, and the documentation is thorough, so it's known what's in there. We have to make sure that anything done with any new kind of method of doing mods conforms to that, so it's documented and known. Okay, so let's look at how do you migrate, whether it's on premise or to the cloud. Working with the Infor migration team, there are two main methods of doing that, actually migrating data, moving the data from the source to the target. One is traditional migration tools, where you run a test migration, then a second test migration, then a full-scale test, and then a go live, and you basically migrate all the data at a certain point in time. The second method is migration by replication, where you use software like Mimic Share to replicate from the source database to the target database. The advantage of that was seen as being, okay, at the cutover, we're not moving a large volume of data, so we're going to get a quicker cutover window or a cutover time. Yes, that's true. But we've learned quite a bit from projects recently on this second replication method. And just to briefly recap, the way this uses, and whether it's in an I-series or Windows or Postgres or whatever, each M3 database logs all the changes, and this method of migration basically does log mining by reading whether it's an I-series journal or logs on a Windows, and it picks up those changes and then replicates them into the target environment. So, and we worked out a way of mapping from the source to the target layer the different versions. It works very well, but like any piece of software, it has its wrinkles, if you like. So I won't go into too much detail on this, but through recent project experience, we know that you can do transformation in this kind of thing, but it has its limitations. We've learned that it's best not to map every file because some are empty, and that's not efficient from a performance point of view. Watch out for primary key changes. You don't want to replicate low volume, high transaction tables like the number series table because it doesn't work very efficiently. And I learned that we need better and faster reconciliation tools. I know that because at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning of the Easter weekend, I was working with spreadsheets to reconcile the data for a go live cutover, and perhaps we need to automate that a bit more rather than me relying on me at 2 o'clock in the morning. So yes, it does work well, but we just need to understand these things. I'd also mention that we mentioned 2 of those methods. I would say so the standard migration method, the replication method. There is a third method which is not officially announced, which is very exciting because our first customer went live on that a couple of weeks ago. Is migration by incremental migration, whereby you just migrate the changes periodically. And I won't go on any more about that, but if you want to talk about that, then please let me know. Okay. And the other thing, just lastly, for the last 2 or 3 years, we always assumed that if we're migrating large volumes of data to the cloud, and it's single tenant or multi-tenant now, we would use this replication method. But it's worth pointing out that, yes, I'm sure it'll work fine, but this actually has not yet been done. So if in that case, maybe a proof of concept would be a wise move. So in conclusion about migrating to either single tenant or multi-tenant cloud, I would just say that your particular requirements in terms of your data volume, your cutover window available, any data transformation you want to make as part of that upgrade or that migration. So, for example, the most involved would be, like database consolidation. We need to just be a little bit cautious here and think about what the best strategy is, because there might be a wrong answer given your needs. So my advice would be to, if you're thinking about upgrading to the cloud, or get some expert advice right at the start. And I would be very happy for people to contact me to start a dialogue about how to do that and what the best method is. Okay, last point about go lives, and this is as a direct result of a project that went live the Easter weekend, the one that I mentioned. And the customer was a food distribution company who was migrating from 10.1 to 13.4 on premise on an I-series platform. The difference for them, the high priority for them was they run virtually 24/7. They have quite a large database at 10 terabytes, and are quite risk averse. They have a very high transaction volume, so that orders taken one afternoon are delivered the next morning, and so even with much negotiation, the largest cutover window available over Easter, including all the business activities, not just the technical ones, was 21 hours. And they were using this replication method using the Mimic Share project. It was quite a complicated environment with multiple integrations and high availability setup. Now, the lesson really was that, and we've grown used to working remotely, and I was instrumental in developing the M3 migration team in Manila, and they work remotely, of course. And so we're used to working remotely. This was quite a high pressure and complex go live, and the customer decided to have basically all the resources on site rather than remote, which I sort of thought maybe that's a little bit over the top, but I was wrong. And the lesson learned, and this is not exactly a typical go live, was there were some issues during the go live weekend, but because everybody was there in the same room, the problems were solved very quickly by various members of the team, and not only was the timeline unaffected, but we're able to deliver the working M3 system back an hour and a half before it was promised. And if we'd had remote support, we would have solved those same issues, but we'd probably have overrun the actual available window. So the message really is, and again, I'm saying this is perhaps not an entirely typical project, but it's worth considering what the appropriate resources for go live support are. It's an insurance policy, yes, but in this case, it really paid out, and the customer was extremely happy, although it was quite a substantial investment, that having everybody on site meant that the go live cutover was delivered in a shorter time than had been promised. So perhaps worth a thought. Anyway, that comes to the end of the presentation that I plan to give. I would thank you for your time, and just say, if you want to talk about upgrade strategy or plans or projects, or I'm happy to speak to people, whether you want to talk about just advice and guidance, or we can be involved in a project or even deliver the project itself. But I'll be pleased to hear from you. Anyway, again, I thank you for your time, wish you a good day, and say goodbye.